number of months there, and markets seemed to look the other way when it came to U.S.-China relations.
While Washington talks about leadership and strength, reality is crumbling right under its feet. For the first time in decades, one of America's most loyal allies has taken a step that could change everything. Canada, the country with which the US shares the world's longest peaceful border, is suddenly turning toward China. Yes, Canada, the very country that for decades was considered a bastion of Western unity, is now signing new agreements with Beijing, supporting Chinese retaliatory tariffs against the US, and effectively becoming part of an economic bloc directed against Washington.
But this week they turned pretty sour, and it even got personal with the Treasury Secretary in the U.S. Calling one of his Chinese counterparts unhinged, and so it's always been a point of tension. The differences between the two, but they are.
How did this happen? Why did an alliance that seemed unbreakable since World War II suddenly start to crack at the seams? It all started with Donald Trump's decision to make America great again. But the attempt to protect national interests turned into a geopolitical boomerang. New 100% tariffs, restrictions on technology exports, and pressure on allies under the slogan America First put Canada in a corner. The country, whose economy had depended on trade with the US for decades, was faced with a choice: submit to American conditions or seek a new path. This choice became a turning point. Beijing did not miss the moment. While the White House was increasing pressure, China offered Ottawa what Washington could not: investment, markets, and most importantly, respect for its sovereignty. Secret negotiations, diplomatic visits, mutual declarations of a new era of partnership, all this painted a picture in which Canada ceased to be a junior partner and began to play its own game.
They're definitely heating up now, and they're a long way from a deal for sure. But as one of you guys mentioned, the first thing they need to do.
When news of Canada's support for Chinese tariffs against the US hit the global headlines, a scandal erupted in Washington. Trump's advisors spoke of betrayal, congressmen demanded sanctions, and the media called it the greatest failure of American foreign policy in the last 30 years. But in Ottawa, the tone was quite different. There, they spoke of maturity, independence, and the right to decide their own fate without looking back at the White House. Against this backdrop, global markets faltered. The Canadian dollar rose, Chinese indices grew, and American companies panicked and revised their contracts. The economic map of North America was changing before our very eyes. In Brussels and London, they discussed whether Canada could now be trusted as a member of NATO, while in Beijing they rejoiced at the new strategic breakthrough. What began as a trade war quickly turned into a struggle for influence, resources, and the future of the world order. The irony is that it was America, in trying to isolate China, that isolated itself. From this point on, the line between allies and rivals is becoming less and less clear, and the familiar balance of power is becoming increasingly fragile.
Eye to eye on the impact, and the U.S. is trying to rally other countries together to form a sort of united front and some sort of group response to what China has announced. And China is basically sort of exploiting the fact that the U.S. has gone around the world in the past several months and put tariffs on everybody. And that
today, no one can say where this story will end. But one thing is clear: the world in which the US dictated the rules is becoming a thing of the past. And if Canada has indeed decided to stand alongside China, this is not just a diplomatic move. It is a signal to the whole world that even the oldest alliances can collapse if they are no longer based on trust. When Donald Trump announced the introduction of 100% tariffs on Chinese goods, the world understood that a new chapter in global confrontation had begun. This decision was not just an economic move, but an act of political pressure designed to demonstrate strength and determination to make America great again. The White House announced that from now on, every country would play by American rules, and if anyone tried to act differently, they would have to pay. Beijing responded almost immediately. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce issued a statement saying that the country was not afraid of a trade war and was ready to impose symmetrical measures against American imports. The markets began to show signs of unrest, but no one expected at the time that this conflict would affect not only China, but also the closest allies of the United States. The first cracks in the alliance with Canada became apparent in early 2024, when the Trump administration decided to extend tariffs to goods from its northern neighbor. In Washington, This was presented as restoring justice because, according to the president himself, Canada has taken advantage of American generosity for years. The tariffs covered steel, aluminum, timber, and automobiles, key sectors of the Canadian economy. For Ottawa, it was a blow that was compared to an economic siege. Many in the Canadian government hoped that this was a temporary measure, a way to put pressure on China, and that the White House would not punish its long-standing partner. But when, a few weeks later, Trump signed an executive order extending the tariffs and imposing restrictions on software exports, it became clear that this was not a mistake, but a strategy.
That doesn't really win you friends if what you want is to get a consensus to stand up to China. So it's going to be a real test of the U.S.'s protectionist policy that we're going to see play out. We only have another 3-4 weeks until the ceasefire on higher tariffs between the U.S. and China expires. So they've got a lot of work to do to get things back on track in not a long amount of time to get there.
At that moment, no one suspected that China was already preparing a response not only to the US, but to all of North America. According to several economic analysts, Beijing began actively building a new network of trade alliances to circumvent US sanctions. Canada was among the first potential partners. Chinese diplomats acted quickly and cautiously. Against the backdrop of official statements about a peaceful settlement, closed-door negotiations were held with Canadian officials. Formally, the talks focused on energy cooperation and the exchange of renewable energy technologies, but behind the scenes more ambitious issues were discussed, such as the creation of alternative logistics routes, investments in northern ports, and long-term contracts for the supply of natural gas. For Canada, this was a tempting offer. After the introduction of US tariffs, thousands of jobs were threatened, and provincial budgets began to shrink. According to estimates by economists at the University of Toronto, the country's losses in the first 3 months after the US measures amounted to more than $40 billion. It was at this point that the Canadian leadership faced a dilemma: continue to play by American rules, or take a risk and start building a new policy. The decision was not an easy one. Fierce debates began within the country. Some ministers believed that it was impossible to go against the US, since more than 70% of Canadian exports go there. Others, on the contrary, argued that dependence on Washington made the country vulnerable. For the first time in decades, public opinion polls recorded an alarming shift. More than half of Canadians said that the US was no longer a reliable partner. The media eagerly discussed Trump's economic nationalism and said that Canada must learn to defend itself.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in US trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Meanwhile, China was acting more and more aggressively. Ministerial meetings were held in Beijing to discuss the prospects for the Northeast Energy Corridor, a project that would involve the construction of a gas pipeline from Canadian fields to Chinese terminals via the Arctic. Formally, nothing was signed, but business circles were already talking about multi-billion-dollar investments. The Globe and Mail published an article titled "Beijing Offers Canada the Deal of the Century," and although the government officially denied the existence of any specific agreements, the signal was clear: China was ready to invest in the Canadian economy.
Specifically, under the new US approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Washington saw this as a warning sign. American officials began to suspect that their closest ally might switch sides to their rival. The National Security Advisor publicly warned that Ottawa's rapprochement with Beijing could jeopardize the very foundation of the North American partnership. But words did not stop the process. At the diplomatic level, Canada continued to pretend that everything was under control, but in private conversations, the refrain "America has betrayed us, now we have to think for ourselves" was heard more and more often. The climax came when China announced the introduction of 500% tariffs on American goods, and Canada publicly supported this decision. This was an unprecedented move. No Western country dared to openly side with China in its trade conflict with the US. But Ottawa did just that. Global news agencies immediately broadcast the Canadian Foreign Minister's statement, and within hours it was all over the news. Washington took this as a direct challenge. Donald Trump called Canada's position disgraceful and said that America will not tolerate betrayal by those who have fed off it for decades.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner, and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
This phrase marked the beginning of the end of the old alliance. It was followed by new sanctions, restrictions on financial transfers, and a review of military contracts. Canadian ambassadors in Washington reported that the doors of the White House were effectively closed and many Canadian projects in the US had been frozen. At the same time, a reverse wave began in Beijing. Chinese companies began opening offices in Toronto and Vancouver, and the Chinese media called Canada a partner of the future.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
This came as a shock to the world. Countries that were used to seeing Canada as a neutral participant in international processes suddenly saw it as a new player, decisive, pragmatic, ready to challenge the old rules. The Economist called it the country's economic coming of age, while the Financial Times wrote that Canada has ceased to be America's shadow for the first time. Yet behind the outward glamour of independence lay risks. Debates raged within the country. Some welcomed the new economic freedom, while others feared that closer ties with China would lead to a loss of political autonomy. In Washington, meanwhile, the phrase "we have lost our northern flank" was heard with increasing frequency.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
From that moment on, Canada ceased to be perceived as part of the American system. Behind the scenes at NATO, there were discussions about whether a country that had supported the enemy could be trusted. Some sources claimed that Brussels even considered temporarily restricting Canada's access to confidential alliance materials. Thus, in a matter of months, a friendship that had been tested over decades turned into a fragile and distrustful relationship. The White House no longer saw Ottawa as a reliable ally. And Canada, having once tasted independence, no longer wanted to return to the role of a junior partner. It all started as a trivial trade conflict, but turned into a tectonic shift in geopolitics. America wanted to strengthen its influence, but instead provoked a chain reaction. China seized the opportunity to build a bridge where there had previously been a wall, and Canada unexpectedly found itself at the center of the struggle to reshape the world order. Now there is a new direction of power on the world map, nor the world, unpredictable and dangerous.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
After Canada openly supported China's retaliatory tariffs against the US, the diplomatic landscape changed irreversibly. Beijing spoke of a victory of strategic patience, Washington of a stab in the back, and Ottawa of a new stage of maturity. What began as a forced response to economic pressure quickly turned into a global realignment of alliances. Sensing the moment, China moved forward with the confidence of a power that had finally proven itself capable of breaking the monopoly of American influence. Behind closed doors at the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, contracts worth tens of billions of dollars were already being discussed, including the purchase of Canadian natural gas and rare earth metals. Canada, meanwhile, realized that it was at the epicenter of a global game. A veritable diplomatic marathon began in the country. Delegations flew to Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong, where they discussed not only trade agreements, but also security, energy, and technology issues. Sources in the Chinese media claimed that one of the key points of the negotiations was the creation of a joint fund worth more than $120 billion for investments in infrastructure and green energy. Specialists from China were already working in Canadian ports, studying the possibilities of expanding terminals for future cargo flows across the Pacific Ocean. Officially, this was called a research mission, but in reality, it was the start of a large-scale economic project.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Washington watched this with growing irritation. American think tanks, including the Council on Foreign Relations and the Brookings Institution, began publishing reports with alarming headlines. Canada is losing its neutrality. The North American Union is under threat. One report explicitly stated that if China gained a foothold in the Canadian economy, it would give Beijing access to critical resources, including nickel, uranium, and lithium, which had previously been controlled primarily by American corporations. A crisis was brewing inside the White House. According to CNN, several of Trump's advisors demanded a tough response, including the suspension of military cooperation within NORAD. This decision was never made, but the very fact that it was discussed sent a signal trust had evaporated. The Pentagon was instructed to analyze the potential risks of strategic information leaks through joint programs with Canada. Articles began to appear in the American press hinting that Canada was now economically unsafe. This, in turn, caused a wave of irritation in Ottawa, where the publications were perceived as an attempt to discredit the country. Meanwhile, Beijing acted methodically. Chinese media, including the Global Times, turned the Canada story into a propaganda success. National channels broadcast stories about a new northern partner that was not afraid to challenge US pressure. On the Chinese platforms Weibo and Bilibili, this story garnered hundreds of millions of views. Analysts in Beijing called it a soft victory that was worth more than any military triumph.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
Canada, in turn, used this information to strengthen domestic support. The rhetoric of independence intensified in the country. Federal television channels featured speeches by economists who said that it is time to stop being an appendage of the American economy. Provincial governments began promoting economic sovereignty programs that called for the development of their own technology chains and reduced dependence on the US. Even Canadian farmers, traditionally oriented toward the American market, began looking for opportunities in Asia. But behind the outward enthusiasm lay tension. American corporations began to withdraw capital from Canada, and several large companies, especially in the automotive and aerospace sectors, froze new projects. The markets reacted painfully. The Canadian Stock Exchange lost about 8% in the first weeks after the announcement of support for China before stabilizing. However, Beijing quickly filled the vacuum. Chinese banks, including the Bank of China and ICBC, opened credit lines for Canadian companies affected by US tariffs. The press called it a rescue plan from the East.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to US IEEPA tariffs.
The reaction of the American public was predictable. On Fox News, Canada became a symbol of betrayal. Hosts accused Ottawa of selling North America for cheap gas. There were calls in Congress to review all trade agreements, and some senators proposed imposing visa restrictions on Canadian officials involved in negotiations with China. But in Canada itself, these threats only reinforced anti-isolationist sentiments. People began to perceive the pressure from Washington as proof that their decision was the right one. When the dust settled a little, it became clear that Canada was no longer a junior partner. It was a qualitatively new status, a country that, for the first time, was acting not within the American system, but as an independent player. The international media wrote that Canada had found its voice, and analysts called what was happening economic separatism. At the UN, where Canada usually acted in tandem with the US, its representatives now voted differently, sometimes abstaining and sometimes directly supporting Chinese initiatives, especially on energy and climate issues. For Trump, this was a personal defeat. According to the Washington Post, he repeatedly said in private conversations that Canada has forgotten who gave it its market and protection. However, few people cared about his words. Ottawa was now speaking a different language. There, they claimed that the new partnership with China was not a betrayal, but a response to unfair treatment. One Canadian Finance Ministry official even compared the White House's policy to parental custody that it was time to break free from. The international community watched this with mixed feelings. In Europe, there was discussion about whether Canada's example would be contagious for other US allies tired of American pressure. In Latin America, the leaders of some countries stated outright that Canada had shown how to step out of Washington's shadow and survive. Even in Japan and South Korea, cautious statements began to be heard about the need to diversify trade ties. But perhaps the most important thing was happening not in diplomatic corridors, but in public perception. Millions of people around the world saw that the US was not to be feared, that even a country completely dependent on the American economy could take a step away and not perish. This changed the very psychology of international relations.